And what he found was the twins gained almost exactly the same weight. But when you looked across the different twins, what he found was some of them gained about 7 pounds and others gained 27 on exactly the same calories. And so the point is, calories in, calories out definitely matter, but it doesn't have the same effect on each individual. And that's important to think about.
What is up, guys? Welcome back. And in today's video, we're going to talk everything about fat loss, really some of the very simple concepts that you need to understand if you are struggling to lose weight. Don and I have been in a conversation today, really talking about this concept of calories in versus calories out, which ultimately is what essentially calorie balance is. And I think what we're seeing in the media and in a lot of the health and wellness space is that people make it really nebulous, that there has to be some strange and exotic formula or some magic pill to make fat loss happen. That essentially is not true. There's calories in. We know that there's proteins, carbohydrates, fats, and I'll include alcohol in there. And then the other side of the equation is calories out. And when we think about calories out, we think about resting metabolic rate, also known as basal metabolic rate, which is roughly 60%. And that is skeletal muscle, which makes up roughly 20% of that, and then organs. The majority of basal metabolic rate or resting metabolic rate is actually organs. And what I mean by organs, I mean brain and liver and kidneys and the things that you need to stay alive, right? All the things that you need to stay alive. And then there, of course, is the other component of calories out.
It's the things that have to run while you're sleeping.
That's right. That's a much better way of explaining it. It's the things that have to run while you're sleeping. And what, you don't think about breathing usually. The other component of that equation is also exercise or activity, physical activity. Of physical activity, we have purposeful activity, which is exercise, whether that's aerobic or resistance training. And I'll just kind of bunch those in purposeful activity. And then there's non-purposeful activity, which is NEAT, non-exercise activity, right? It's non-exercise activity thermogenesis, something like that. It's the component of activity. For example, do you work at a desk? Are you always fidgeting? Me, I have a very high NEAT, which is, if you're sitting there talking to me, I'm doing this, or I'm doing this, or I'm moving around, where Don is, calm and collected and much less spastic than I am. And then the other component of the physical activity aspect is, so we talked about exercise induced thermogenesis. There's the non-exercise induced thermogenesis. And then the third component is the thermic effect of feeding. And that really relates to the amount of energy it takes for the nutrients to be metabolized. And that would be, protein has an advantage there because it's roughly, the thermal effect of protein is roughly 20%, whereas fat, Don, I think fat is like 3%. It's much lower.
Fat and carbohydrate are usually listed at about 5%. So protein is significantly higher.
Protein is higher. And so, there's all these nuances that I believe, and that I'm sure Don believes will come out later on in terms of calorie absorption. For example, does the gut microbiome play a role in increased absorption of certain nutrients? Do two people who eat the same amount of calories, do they absorb them the same? Do hormones play a role? All of these things are interesting questions, but it still comes down to calories in, depending on what your baseline caloric need is. And that is certainly variable for everyone, versus calories out. And, Don, one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about was, so now you guys understand the secrets to fat loss, which is really not a secret. It's calories in versus calories out. The calories out are the foods that you consume or the energy that you consume. The calories out, are the, resting metabolic rate, energy expenditure for activity, not exercise activity, and then the thermal effect of feeding. Don, so let's talk about protein and fat loss. And I think that that's really a part of the conversation that we can impact. You don't really change resting metabolic rate that much. but you can change the thermoeffective
think,
feeding. You can influence it.
yeah, maybe before we get into the protein, just a couple of examples I think are useful to people. You made the comment about calories in, calories out, and I think what people need to, they immediately start thinking everybody's the same. A calorie doesn't miss a single person. And one of the classic studies that I always like, and I always make my students read, is by Claude Bouchard. It was back in the late 70s or early 80s. I don't remember it. But what he did is he took, I think it was 16 twins, pairs of twins, and he overfed them for 6 or 8 weeks, 1,000 calories a day. So it was all very controlled. They were in a laboratory. He knew exactly what their baseline diet was. He overfed them by 1,000 calories per day. And what he found was the twins gained almost exactly the same weight. But when you looked across the different twins, what he found was some of them gained about 7 pounds and others gained 27 on exactly the same calories. And so the point is, calories in, calories out definitely matter, but it doesn't have the same effect on each individual. And that's important to think about. It always comes down to energy in and energy out, but everybody's a little different.
I think that's a really, really important point.
Calorie doesn't mean the same to every individual. So anyway, back to your protein question.
No, I think that's a really good, natural component of the conversation is, and I look around, I do have patients that they exercise and they train, they do count their calories, and, they're at a very low caloric range and they're still not losing weight. And the question is that a calorie adaptation, right? Does their resting metabolism slow down? Who knows?
It probably is a factor. It's probably a factor of resting metabolism. It may be that non-purposeful exercise, the fidgeting. We don't really know why there's this big difference, but we definitely know there's differences between people.
And I think that's interesting. I have one patient that I'm thinking of right now, and she does a ton of physical activity. And she actually struggles to lose weight. What's interesting is that she compensates for, we're talking about 2 hours of really hard training. She's perimenopause. And I mean, that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I mean, there are hormone changes that happen. Also, that's the time where sleep apnea happens, skeletal muscle mass can change, but she is actually compensating calorically for her activity. The problem with this becomes, again, we have a rigid concept of how much calories individuals should utilize. We have the Harris-Benedict equation. We have all these different equations where, I guess in broad population studies, they're validated, but really, when you think about individuality, and even in your studies, some of the earlier studies that I worked on, we had, I remember when Kraft was providing all the foods, they were coming in and getting the foods and we were measuring it out, and it's interesting because those weight loss studies did show with a certain amount of caloric deficit that weight loss occurs. And, when we talk about caloric deficit, your weight loss study women, I think were they 1,500 calories a day? I don't remember, 12 to 1,500.
Yeah. So we started out with a target of 500 calorie deficit over what we thought they were starting at. And so that worked out to be we thought they were probably around 2,300 as best we could guess. So we were targeting 1,600 to 1,700 as their diet loss.
Okay.
And doing that, and clearly when you're in a research study, it's hard, and the subjects are sort of free living. It's hard to know exactly what they eat, but we saw a big range in what people would lose on that same kind of regimen. And, some of it's variation in, probably their actual calorie intake, but some of it's just individual variation.
And I think that's important to keep in mind. And I'm sure you guys watching are thinking, okay, well, then, Dr. G, what can I do? Well,
and to that point, the way we did it was we said to each individual, we would like you to be losing 1 to 2 pounds a week. And so we're going to start out with this caloric deficit. And at the end of a week or 2 weeks, if you haven't lost 3 pounds, you have to reduce your intake more. So we basically didn't get all hung up on things like Harris Benedict, which, as you were pointing out, relate to maybe if you're dealing with 1,000 people, but it doesn't relate to an individual.
Yeah.
But by doing that, we let each individual sort of make adjustments to maintain the weight loss as opposed to counting the calories.
This is a wonderful lead-in to the next part of the video, which is when you lose weight, you typically lose a combination of skeletal muscle mass. And notice I am not saying lean mass, which I think in another video we can talk about. There is a difference between lean mass. Lean mass is all your organs. It's everything but adipose tissue. And I think even do bones count as lean mass too?
Generally, a DEXA type measurement gives you fat versus everything else.
Right.
Sometimes you'll see bone sorted out of it because DEXA will give you that, but most times it's lean mass is sort of everything else.
Right. So you guys have to understand that when you hear, and I want you to really pay attention because you're going to start hearing this in the conversation, not in our conversation as much, but in the general media or kind of blogospheres, people talk about lean mass. Well, lean mass also includes all your organs.
Yeah.
And when you were saying that they reduce their calories, typically in weight loss, you lose fat and muscle. And this is where dietary protein comes in, because you can affect the quality of the weight that you lose by protecting skeletal muscle. So if we were to list out the key reasons why protein is so powerful in weight loss, I mean, there's what, four or five really big reasons. And we can go through that. But I would say one of those reasons is the maintenance of skeletal muscle mass when you're doing that.
I mean, the weight loss percentages are very interesting to look at in that, depending on, are you starving? Are you starving, bed fast, or, how much physical activity? A body composition weight loss can be 50% lean mass or muscle mass. If you're looking at just sort of normal weight loss where people are decreasing 500 calories and maintaining normal activity, you can still see that about 40% of the weight loss is lean tissues and muscle mass. And what we showed, and others have also shown, is that if you go to a higher protein diet, low carb, to do that, you'll move that up to about 75% fat, 25% lean. And if you go to high protein plus resistance exercise, you can move it up to 95% fat, 5% lean. So you can sort of have an impact on those body composition changes by both diet and the exercise that you team with it.
And that's a really important point, because when you're talking about calorie restriction, there's a lot of discussion about keto and the vegan vegetarian diets, but if you maintain, and what is so great about this is this has been in the data in the literature for a very long time, is that when you maintain and correct for protein and you optimize for protein and you have higher amounts of protein, then you protect the weight that you're losing. You protect not only the lean mass, which is organ size, but also you protect skeletal muscle. The other way and listen, why is skeletal muscle mass so important? It's not so important for your basal metabolic rate or your resting metabolism. Really, where skeletal muscle mass shines is in the activity, in whether it's exercise activity and also just getting up and moving around activity, because it is a site for glucose disposal. And you can increase energy expenditure by training, whether it's aerobic or resistance exercise. I don't know if you have more to add to why muscle is so important for weight loss.
Yeah, I mean, there are a number of different things one could add. I think it's important for people to recognize that the first fuel of muscle is actually fatty acids.
Right.
Mitochondria and training, that's the first fuel. Carbohydrates are used in two cases. One is with high intense exercise, if you get above heart rates of like 120 beats per minute, it's referred to as 60% VO2 max, carbohydrates then have to become a dominant fuel because it's anaerobic. You can't take in enough oxygen to burn that level of fuel. That's that's sort of the fight or flight mentality. It becomes very carbohydrate. The other is after a high carb meal, because you think about carbohydrates actually have a relative toxicity to the body because we know of diabetes. So we can't have high blood glucose for a long period of time. That's the definition of diabetes. So basically, when you have a high carb meal, the carbohydrate, the insulin goes up, the glucose is forced into muscle, and muscle ends up it has to burn the carbs. You can say, well, you can store it in glycogen, but you only have glycogen storage capacity if you've just exercised. If you woke up and had a high carb breakfast, sat in front of a computer till noon and have a high carb lunch, there's no place to put glycogen. Right. Your stores are already full. So the only thing you can do with it is burn it or store it as fat. Right. And so muscle plays a big role there in how we manage carbohydrate and fat metabolism.
You guys, that is also a really important point. The other part about protein, and this goes, obviously the reason why protein is so important, one reason is because it stimulates muscle protein synthesis. And you and I were texting, I was looking at some of the literature, looking at that thermoeffective feeding, and I was looking for mechanisms of action, right? Because Don obviously has trained me for a really long time. The Botox is really good. Don doesn't have any, but and one of the things is that you've always taught me to ask questions and question why, and why is it? And I had originally thought that the reason why protein has such a high thermoeffective feeding, meaning it takes so much energy, I actually thought it was due to get rid of the nitrogen compound, but you're saying it's not.
Yeah. So at the beginning of when we started to talk, you said that, food has a thermic effect because of its metabolism. That's totally true. And people have always interpreted that for protein as well. You've got this nitrogen and you have to make urea from it, and it's just harder to deal with. But if you actually go through the metabolism and you really know what you're looking for, the ATP process or requirements for nitrogen handling actually are almost insignificant. It just simply doesn't account for it. So work that we did looking at muscle, we realized that a meal effect that triggers muscle protein synthesis has an enormous effect on ATP use. It's an enormously expensive energy process. And some work by Marguerite Westerterp in Europe has also done a lot of caloric room work where they've looked at this thermic effect. And my personal opinion is that the thermic effect of protein is really due to muscle protein synthesis. And it's just one more reason why we have to be very careful about how we distribute protein so that we have enough to stimulate muscle protein synthesis in at least 2 or 3 meals per day.
That's interesting. Basically, I'm going to summarize that for you guys. What you're saying is that the reason why it takes so much, quote, energy, anticipated energy for protein to be metabolized is not to deal with the nitrogen component, but it is its effect on the activity of muscle protein synthesis, and that would be through mTOR. And that system is very expensive. That is a dynamic and ATP utilizing system, right? Correct me if I'm
I think for every amino acid that is hooked into a new protein, it costs 6 ATPs. It is a very expensive process. And you think about carbohydrate and fat are basically catabolic nutrients. They're basically being broken down for energy, where protein stimulates anabolic processes. And that's totally different than carbohydrate and fat. And that anabolic process is very expensive.
Right. And that goes back. So what does he mean by anabolic process? It's that muscle protein synthesis process. Now, you're not talking about protein turnover as well, are you? you are primarily talking about mTOR. You're not talking about the turnover, or are you?
Yeah, I'm talking mostly about the synthesis process is very expensive. Degradation has some expenditure, but basically you're breaking carbon bonds and you're actually generating some energy back there. So degradation is not nearly as expensive as synthesis.
Got it. And that's
But
why.
but you know, the processes go together. I mean, the reason protein synthesis is so expensive is we have to make 300 grams of new protein every day. So we have to make a lot of it. And that's because of turnover.
What he means by turnover, just for any of the new watchers or listeners, is that it's turnover is protein is constantly degraded and being, I don't know if it's regenerated, but it's constantly being revised would be a good way of putting it. Would you say?
I mean, if you think about what the numbers that I think are important to understand is that at maximum rate of growth, if you look at a 12-year-old or a 16-year-old, their maximum rate of growth, they're laying down maybe 5 grams of new protein per day, not very big.
And how does that translate to muscle, bone, organ? You know, what exactly, how does that translate over? That's part of that is organs, part of that is muscle.
Yeah, it's about, I mean, protein makes up about 20% of weight. I mean, a lot of the weight is water. So when you think about muscle mass, 5 grams would translate into, 20, 25 grams of new muscle.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, it's a small amount, but the body has to make 250 grams per day, or 300, depending on your body weight. And that's a really expensive process. And your point, some of it is to repair proteins that have been damaged, but some of it's to remodel. If you take on a new activity, your muscles trained to do something new, you have to sort of remodel muscle and bone. And that constant turnover allows your body to adapt to new circumstances or simply to repair from an injury.
That makes perfect sense. The other aspect about protein is the satiety effect.
Yeah.
I don't know about you, but I have a good chicken threshold, right? I mean, it's called the "Are you really hungry?" test. If you are really hungry, and I want everyone to try this, put a plain chicken breast in front of you, and if you're really hungry, you're going to eat it. And most of the time,
my argument or my example is the chocolate cake threshold, is that if you get to an end of the meal and you're full and somebody offers you another steak or a piece of chocolate cake, which you're going to eat, I guarantee you're not going to eat more steak. You're full.
Well, I might, but yeah.
Oh yeah.
I might, but
I mean, most people can eat carbohydrates when they're full, but most people can't eat protein when they're full.
Right. It essentially has a mechanism, and the mechanism of action, again, I always want you guys thinking, why is this working, rather than us just telling you, hey, this is what happens. There's always a reason mechanistically why. And protein obviously is very expensive metabolically as it relates to protein turnover and muscle protein synthesis. It's also has an effect on the gut hormones, so the satiety hormones, which means as you ingest it, it releases, as it goes into your digestive system, it releases hormones which send messages for you to feel more full.
Yeah.
How's that for explanation?
We know that protein has this satiety effect. We know that it affects a lot of metabolic outcomes, but we don't really know what's most important. Nobody has really sorted that out. So we know that protein slows gastric emptying. You just mechanically, you feel full longer. We know that it increases hormones like GLP-1 and PYY and even CCK, which all affect metabolism and satiety. But we also know it affects the brain. We know tryptophan and other things, things like GLP-1 will affect your brain reaction to hunger. So it's a very complex mechanism. There's a lot we know about it. And frankly, we have no clue what's the most important part.
I think that's really interesting. I actually hadn't thought about that. And then, so satiety, lean muscle mass, thermo-effective feeding. What else am I missing? I feel like I'm missing something. Is there anything else that makes protein important in weight loss?
I mean, we started out with the body composition effect. So you can maintain your composition, your resting energy expenditure will tend to stay higher. We know that there's a thermic effect, which is probably due to protein turnover also. We know there's the satiety effects. And then there's just simply, if you add protein in, presumably you're substituting it for something. And most of the data says if you substitute it for carbohydrates, metabolically, that's going to be a lot better. You know, you can lower the insulin amount required and all of those kinds of things. So there's hormone benefits to substituting protein for carbs.
Yes. And the gluconeogenic effect in terms of blood sugar regulation, which, you know, just roughly, you know, this seems to be a question in a lot of the low carb keto groups, but really for every 100 grams of protein ingested, you'll generate 60 grams of glucose, but it's not the same as, and, you know, please correct me, it's not the same as ingesting 60 grams of straight glucose. It is through a process through the liver where your body is generating on its own rather than having swings of insulin.
And it happens very slowly where carbs, you basically, whatever carbs you eat in the meal have to be disposed of in about 2 hours after the meal, or you get metabolic abnormalities. Where protein, we know that after a protein meal, your blood levels will be elevated for 5 or 6 hours. So basically after a dinner meal, it's literally amino acids are being metabolized all through the night. And so it's just a much slower process. It's more continuous. And so to your point, we don't get these big swings in glucose or insulin that you do with higher carbohydrate diets.
Yep. I know you guys.
One of the things that people need to recognize is people on higher protein diets will tend to have higher fasting blood glucose. Because a fasting blood glucose in somebody who has a high carb is actually quite low, because it's basically at night you're running on glycogen and you're running out. Where when you're running on a higher protein diet, gluconeogenesis is keeping it pretty flat 24 hours a day.
Yep. All right, guys, this was probably one of my favorite videos. If you like the channel and the conversations, I will have more conversations coming, different kinds of things. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. I know that we both do. If you have not already subscribed, please subscribe to the channel. This is a labor of love for us, and we spend the time talking about it, looking at research, and then drop a comment below, and I do my best to answer and accommodate you guys. So thanks so much for tuning in.